Today I'm going to be working on the flight planning portion of a trip that we have coming up soon, and I thought it'd be kind of fun to sort of just share this experience. I'll try not to make this video super technical, but it's going to be a little bit because, well, you just can't plan a flight like this without really knowing some of the intricacies. So if we lose you a little bit, bear with us. If you have an interest in aviation, or maybe if you've ever flown general aviation before, you may have heard some of this terminology, or you might be super familiar with it. So this trip that's coming up, we're going to be traveling a long distance over some wilderness areas and into some areas that I'm not personally familiar with. We're going to be flying a 1973 Cessna 182, and that's going to become really important. Unlike cars, the make and model of an airplane is extremely important because there are certain limitations that have to be considered when planning a flight. Cars, we kind of just load them up until they won't go anymore and we don't really think anything of it. Or we pack the thing till we can't see out the side view mirrors and the rear window and call it a day. Cars are super forgiving, but airplanes not so much. We'll kind of talk more about that stuff a little bit later. In the simplest terms possible, the three things that we need to determine in this planning process is the plane capable of the mission that we're trying to achieve? Is the pilot capable of the mission? And finally, are the passengers capable of the mission? I know that sounds probably atypical because nobody really asks whether the passengers care or not. But I have a personal minimum when I fly, and that is that I don't allow passengers on my airplane. Meaning, anybody who's on that airplane is to some degree going to be involved in the aviating. Nobody gets to just take up a seat, pick up the New York Times, and pretend like they don't care about what's going on. There's just too much that needs to be done, and it's helpful if I can delegate some of the easier tasks for other people to do, and that allows me as the pilot to focus on flying and taking care of the more difficult tasks. So there are quite a few steps that we need to take in order to determine whether the plane is capable of this journey. One, how much fuel can we carry, and are we willing to make stops for fuel, or where are we going to make stops for fuel? And something else is going to become very important, and that's going to be the weather and temperature, things like that will determine whether our aircraft can perform such that the flight is safe. The next thing that we need to consider is the pilot, and that would be myself. I'll be doing the flying. I'm a private pilot. I have about 200 hours total time, and the majority of that time is actually in this airplane. That's a really important fact because just because somebody has a lot of time, for example, an airline pilot, maybe an airline captain, if they were to get in this airplane, they may or may not know how to fly it well, even though they fly big jets. So it just so happens that most of my time is in this aircraft, and I feel very proficient in flying this aircraft. When you're planning a cross-country trip in a car, you can punch the address where you're starting and the address where you want to end up into an app or a GPS like Google Maps or Apple Maps, something like that. And it will give you a few different routes that you can take and maybe give you some construction and delays, and based on the speed limit of the roads and the traffic and things, it'll make a calculation about roughly how long it'll take you to get there. Unfortunately, with flying, it gets way more complicated. The good news is flying has come into the 21st century, and like driving, we have a lot of digital tools that can do things very quickly for us. Things that would have required quite a bit of patience in the past with paper charts. If you think that paper charts would have been dinosaurs by now, you'd be wrong. In fact, in some cases, we're legally required to carry charts in the aircraft. So paper in aviation is far from dead, and there's good reasoning for that. So today, we're going to be using an electronic solution both on the computer and on my iPad to do the majority of our flight planning. But we could use charts to do the same thing. In fact, before we go on this flight, I'm going to map our entire route of flight on paper charts, and we're going to have them in the aircraft. That way, if something were to happen to my iPad or my iPhone, which both have a digital navigation or aviation app on them, we could revert back to using paper charts because the batteries just don't die on charts. Before we jump into creating a tentative route of flight, let's talk briefly about weather. Outside of the plane and the pilot, weather's probably the most important determining factor whether we should attempt this mission or not. And we can't do that the way most people do on their phone, like, all right, let's pull up the weather for such a place. All right, it's got like a partly cloudy symbol. Partly cloudy is not going to cut it when it comes to aviation. We really need to look at long-term, high-level overview forecast to try to decide what the weather pattern is, not so much what the weather will be at a particular point in time. And that will help us to kind of look big picture and determine really when to leave. There's a saying, if you have time to spare, go by air. And part of the reason for that is that we can't really just leave when we feel like it. Although aviation is faster, you can't just hop in the car no matter what the weather's doing. It could be blowing sideways 100 miles an hour and raining upside down, and you'll get in your car and go, because cars are just that reliable. But with aviation, we have to be a little bit more careful about what we get ourselves into. There's another saying that you'd rather be on the ground wishing you were up there instead of being up there wishing you were on the ground. So let's go ahead and start working on a tentative route of flight that will give us a kind of context around which to ask all these other questions about the pilot, the plane, and the weather. So we're going to be using a software today called ForeFlight, and there are many different softwares that can do this same function. This just happens to be something that I subscribe to. We like to use this type of software because it integrates well with our iPad, and it also gives us redundancy in the cockpit, and we find that it works very well. So let's start our flight here at Sandpoint Airport, which is Sierra Zulu Tango. And let's go ahead and put our destination in here. We actually want to fly to Bishop, California, which is KBIH. And this is going to be what's called direct to. And basically it just gives us a straight line. So imagine you had to drive this route. It's going to take us probably close to 20 hours. I don't know about you, but I can't do 16 hours straight, and you're going to have to get fuel in there probably at least twice. So let's call that 20 hours. And if we were to fly direct non-stop, it's giving us an ETE of about 5 hours. Now, if we're not going to do that, we're going to make some stops, but that just gives you some idea that this could be somewhere around a quarter of the time to get there, or maybe around a third, depending on how many stops we end up making. So we have our direct route of flight. This is kind of where we start asking about the aircraft and the pilot. So I don't know about you, but I can't go 5 hours without using the restroom. And it's not really fun, and I can tell you that the passengers on the flight aren't going to want to do that either. So we need to think about how we can make some stops and kind of give us a chance to rest and also to use the restroom and take breaks. So with a 5-hour flight, it's not a terrible idea to break that thing up into about a third and a third and a third. So if I look down here, we're actually going to cross right over the top of Winnemucca. So why not use that as a waypoint? So we can throw Winnemucca in here, and we'll just see what that looks like, KWMC. So our route of flight changed just slightly, and it looks like our time went up about a minute or two. And let's kind of take a look at what that does to our flights. Obviously, we try to stay as close to this straight line as possible for maximum efficiency. Anywhere we go left or right is going to cost us time. It looks like Baker City, Council, Ontario. There's a few stops that we could make. Because the mountains are over here, we might not want to go that direction. So let's just pull this over here, and let's throw Baker City in there. That's a good stopping point. And so now looking over here, we've got our 663 nautical mile trip split into 200, 230, and 215 mile legs. That's not too shabby, and it added, looks like it didn't add much time currently to the trip, so we're still under the 5-hour mark. So just a quick note to emphasize the importance of being able to use electronic planning. If we were to draw that flight route on paper charts, we would have to have a total of 4 charts. So these things get to be very large, and imagine trying to have this in the cockpit of a very small airplane, and you're trying to fly, and you've got to have 4 of these. So this is the advantage, why we like to do as much planning as we can, but then we can transfer it to these charts. So I just wanted to illuminate that. It's kind of an interesting reality that all this stuff can literally fit on this device or for these pieces of paper. Let's talk a little bit about the airplane. So airplanes don't have like miles per gallon per se. It's more a matter of fuel burn. And the reason for that is primarily because there can be wind. It's more like a boat than it is a car. So a river, for example, has current, right? The water's moving, and then your boat has to not only overcome the power of the current, but also has to propel itself upriver. And an airplane is the same way. So we measure fuel burn in gallons per hour, not so much in miles per gallon. And so what we can do is kind of figure out how many hours are there between legs based on the wind, and that'll give us an idea if we have enough fuel to go between legs or maybe multiple legs. I've transferred our very basic flight plan to my iPad because the iPad has a bunch of features built into it that just aren't available on the desktop. So the iPad will tell us how long each leg is. So each leg of this trip looks like it's about an hour 40. Leg 1, leg 2, and leg 3. That's a pretty nice even distribution. We also know that we have about 5 hours of fuel aboard our airplane, and so we can go at least that long, but we do have to have at least half an hour of fuel left when we land. But I can tell you that most people's bladders can't stand that. So why don't we just say that we'll make a fuel stop at Winnemucca. That's going to be about 3 hours or so, maybe 3.5 of flight time. And that gives us plenty of fuel, and we should be able to get fuel there. And then we'll have plenty of fuel to get down here to Bishop. So one of the next things that we need to figure out about our flight plan is certain things that will affect our ability to get from here to there. So unlike driving a car, there are certain airspaces or portions of the sky that we just can't fly through, or there are certain times where it would be a bad idea to do so. So on the iPad, there's these little red areas that kind of look like a circle, and some of them look like squares and triangles. Here's a square. These actually represent what are called temporary flight restrictions. And these are areas that we just can't fly through temporarily because of something. So here's an area near Baker that has a flight restriction, and it looks like there's actually a forest fire in that area, and they're restricting traffic in here because of that fire. So we would want to fly around that and avoid that area. Obviously, if there's a fire there, we don't want to go through there anyway. So why don't we just deviate just a hair? This will take us around there, so we'll fly to LeGrand, and then we can go to Baker. And just like that, we're around that flight restriction. This one here is not really a problem, so let's kind of look farther south. I don't really see much. There's one over here at Mammoth, but that's not in our way. All right, so that takes care of forest fires. In the summer flying, forest fires are a big problem in the West and in Midwest. These things can pop up at any time, so you really want to be abreast of what's happening. And this is another reason that the digital charts are nice, because they overlay this for us so we don't accidentally fly into one of these areas, causing a safety problem or potentially causing risk to ourselves. So there's another type of airspace that we need to be careful of, and that's military areas. And they come in many different flavors, and they're pretty easy to spot because on the charts they have pink and blue kind of borders around them. So looking at our course of flight, I don't see anything up here near Baker. I do see one here on our way from Baker to Winnemucca. So this is what's called the military operations area, and it looks like there's a couple of them here. And it looks like it goes from 8,000 feet to 18,000 feet. And let's kind of see if there's any kind of hours. So it looks like it's not open. The hours here is just intermittent. So we would probably want to be talking to a center or some sort of air traffic control to find out if there's any military activity in that area. If so, we may have to deviate. They don't own that airspace, but depending on what they're doing there, we may not want to fly through it. But if we do fly through it and they're doing something, they may have to stop. So looking farther along in our plan, we're kind of going just by the military operations areas here. And then looks like as we go through Winnemucca, it starts to get pretty messy. All these boxes down here are military operations areas. But these blue boxes are something very important. They're called restricted areas. And restricted means that we need to have permission to fly through those. They're not prohibited, meaning no flight, but we can't just go bombing through there without expecting somebody to pay attention. Unlike the military operations areas, we can't really do that. So it looks like there's a couple of those along our route of flight. So let's pretend like they're going to be doing some really aggressive military things, and let's just fly around that. Let's not even consider that as an option. We'll just put Austin in here as a waypoint so we can just avoid that area altogether. And then it looks like as we go south out of there, I don't really see anything kind of jumping out at me. It looks like we could maybe dodge around these mountains by going by this little airport of Mina. That'll work pretty good. So that's kind of a quick look at airspace. We just want to make sure that we're not flying through things that we're not supposed to. For those that are watching this video that maybe haven't done a lot of aviating recently, this might be a really wacky way to set up a flight plan. But with the modern GPS systems, this is actually the most efficient way to fly, is what we call direct to. And we have a GPS in the airplane. We also have the redundancy of the iPad. And it allows us to just go direct to something. I mean, that's the beauty of flying. In the past, they would have had to use radio navigation aids, things called VORs, ADFs. These are just technical terms for things that you would point the airplane at and you would fly to it because it's a known place, and then you would turn and you would go to the next known place. And it was an efficient way of getting around the country, because if you think about it, you have to have a way to know where you're at and where you're going. So the next thing that we need to answer about the airplane is, do we have enough runway where we're going to and coming from to take off and land? It'd be very embarrassing to get somewhere and realize that, well, you're just not capable of landing there, or worse yet, you land there and now you can't take off for some dumb reason. So let's take a look back at our flight plan and kind of look at the airports that we plan on visiting and make sure that they're within the limitations of the pilot and the aircraft. So we're going to be visiting Baker. It's going to be a good place to stop and rest. And the charts actually tell us some information, but we can also pull this up. And if we scroll down here and look at the runways, we'll see that the runway is actually 5,000 feet long. So it's about a mile long. And then going down here to Winnemucca would be our next stop. And same thing, we can check this one, look at the runway, runways plural. So looks like the primary runway there is actually going to be 7,000 feet long, but my goodness, the wind is ripping there too. Let's see if the other runway's any good. So this runway's got really bad wind also, so it looks like neither of those runways is going to be really good for landing at the moment. So let's just say that we do have plenty of runway. We have 4,000 feet on one, and we've got 7,000 feet on another. But this is something that we need to keep in mind, that at this time of day, which happens to be evening time, the winds can be severe, and those types of winds would actually prohibit us from landing at Winnemucca. We would be in a pretty bad spot if that's actually the current weather there. Landing on either one of those runways would be borderline not possible, or would be a stretch. So what we don't want to do is end up at one of these airports, even though the runway is plenty long, and for some other reason like wind, we're not able to land there. And that's really an aircraft limitation. So paying attention to the weather is going to be really important. All right, so jumping down here to the final destination of Bishop and looking at our runway options, it looks like we've got 5,500, about 7,500, and 5,600. All of those are plenty long enough for us to land. But I can tell you that this part of this planning process can get extremely complicated. I don't want to make this video super technical, so I'm not going to get into the nuances of this, but I will tell you that this portion of the planning is extremely important, and it's where a lot of people get in trouble. Once you're in the air, it's completely different, but getting off the ground and dealing with terrain and stuff like that is actually far more sophisticated than just like, yep, runway's long enough. And unfortunately, we just don't have time in this video to talk about all those subtle nuances. But I will tell you that down here in Bishop, we're not talking about just an airport. If you've never been in this area, it is surrounded by some of the tallest mountains in the lower 48 states. And it's in a very tight valley. And it happens to be in a desert where it gets extremely hot. And airplanes don't work very good when it's hot out. The air becomes less dense. And so the engine doesn't work as good, the propeller doesn't work as good, and the wings don't work as good. So this isn't a matter of just figuring out if the runways are long, but also taking the time to understand how our airplane will perform in those conditions. I've done a lot of those calculations already, and I'm confident that this is something that we can do. But I will tell you that it's not going to be something that's just a once and done deal. We're going to have to really be on our toes to make sure that we don't get in too deep and put ourselves in a situation where the outcome is not good or creates a lot of stress. I actually have a very simple little tool that I purchased for calculating takeoff performance. This process is not simple, and it's always changing because the environment where we're taking off is always changing. So this little computer is called a takeoff performance computer, and I can use this at any time to input all the many variables that are at play at any particular point in time and get a rough idea about how long or how far it's going to take us to get off the ground. And that's part of how we understand whether these runways are long enough or not. But also up in this corner, probably the most important thing, even if you get off the ground, but in this area of Bishop, which is surrounded by very tall mountains, it'll tell us whether or not we can climb out and clear all of those mountains. So I've done these calculations, and I'll tell you that it's not something that we want to do in the late morning or at any time in the afternoon or evening because it gets so hot. So it's going to be really important that we plan this trip such that we're on the ground at Bishop no later than, say, 11 o'clock in the morning. If we can't make it by there, we probably should just plan to go a different day. If you're a pilot and you're watching this video and you've never seen this little doohickey, I'll link to it in the description below. You'll find all the same information in the pilot handbook for your airplane, but you have to do a lot of interpolating and it can be very time consuming. And this guy is very quick and it is compatible with any airplane. So there's one last question that you don't have to really answer in a car, and that's what altitude do you fly, right? So there are lots of different options for altitudes, and there's a really simple rule. When we fly to the east, we fly odd altitudes plus 500, and we do that under visual flight rules, or VFR. When we fly westerly headings, we fly an even thousands altitude with 500 feet added, so say 8,500. When we fly east, we might fly 9,500, something like that. But we have options. We could fly 4,000, 6,000, 8,000, etc. So looking at the iPad, we can actually use a really cool tool that is called a profile. And what it does is it imagines the flight path and it calculates the terrain and all those things to see if we're going to hit something. And the answer at this point on our flight path is we're definitely going to hit some stuff. So the flight plan currently is set up to fly 7,500 feet. Because we're flying a westerly heading most of the time, I'm just going to set this to 10,500 feet. And to help us a little bit, let's set in here a date of departure. Let's say we're going to leave, let's leave Sunday morning at 6 a.m. That'll work. And we'll call it 10,500 feet. So this is going to tell us where we're going to hit something. And that's probably more important than becoming too efficient for wind. So we can see that this flight path is actually going to hit, we're really close right here, 200 feet of clearance. And then over here, we're actually going to full on hit a mountain. So let's zoom in on our flight path and figure out what in the world's going on. All right, so there's a big mountain right here that we need to go around. So why don't we put some other waypoint in here that'll help us to get around those mountains. There's actually a GPS waypoint in the sky called Ever. It doesn't actually exist, it's just an imaginary point in space, but we can use that as a waypoint, and hopefully, now we have only one issue here in the middle of our flight plan that looks like we're getting pretty close. So let's see where that point is. Looks like it's clear back here. What we might do there is just fly a little bit, because we're going to be able to see out the window. We can fly a little bit to one side or the other, although we're not going to put that in our flight plan. But what we could do is kind of drag our flight over here. Maybe we'll put this little airport in there as a waypoint. And now if we go back to our profile, now at 10,500 feet, we're going to have 1,490 feet of clearance above the highest obstacle. And then the next question is actually, what's the most ideal altitude to fly for wind? So the higher we go, the winds get to be more aggressive. And as I mentioned earlier, it becomes a problem for fuel burn. If we're flying into the wind, we're just eating up gas because we're not going as fast across the ground as we are through the air. So this app can actually give us some advice based on forecasts, what the winds will be at different altitudes, and will help us try to figure that out. So it looks like, according to this, if we fly a westerly heading, if we fly 8,500 feet, it looks like it'll take about 10 minutes less overall for the entire trip to make that flight. If we go up to 10,500 feet, it looks like it adds about 10 minutes to the flight. Because of the terrain and all those other hazards, I think we're going to risk going a little higher. Ironically, it looks like our fuel burn is a little bit lower at 10,500 feet, and that's a consequence of how performance works up high. With airplanes, the air is thinner, so there's less friction. So now let's take a look at a feature of the iPad that I would say is priceless, especially if you've never been to an area. So one of the features of a premium subscription to ForeFlight is we're actually able to go through this entire flight in an imaginary way. And so what we're looking at on the screen now is actually this flight in 3D over the real terrain. So here we are leaving Sandpoint, we're climbing out over the lake and over the mountains here, and we're heading toward Coeur d'Alene. And then, boy, look at us out over the desert. And we can fly this whole entire flight in real time. There's the Snake River, and we're coming up on the Blues Mountains. That's such a beautiful area. And then here we are coming around La Grande. So we're coming into La Grande there. Of course, we said there was a flight restriction because there's a fire just north of there. And then here we are at Baker. So we're gonna actually land here and take a potty break, look around, and then we're off and going again. And here we are out over the mountains again in the wilderness. Boy, it's brown out there. And then lots of mountains, lots of things to look at. I think it's really important to communicate this is all wilderness. There's just nothing out here. There are a few airports. If we had a mechanical issue or something like that, we could get on the ground. And then before we know it, here we are in Winnemucca. Well, look, like lots of crop circles, signs of life. And then there we are. There's Winnemucca Airport. And so what we would do is stop here, take a look at our fuel, empty our bladders, and away we go again. Now we're starting to get into some of the high terrain. So remember, this is, imagine we're at 10,500 feet in the airplane. And see that mountain there? I mean, we're coming pretty close to some pretty tall mountains. And then going through those military areas, heading to the south. Boy, it looked like we were going to run into those mountains, didn't it? So some of those mountains are as high as 14,000 feet. So we're actually below those mountains still. And then here we are coming in, and I think we're getting close to our final turn. Well, it looks like we're just going across a bunch of mountains. Boy, there's lots of very big brown mountains out there. And now we're descending, and now we're coming into, I think it's called the Owens Valley. And then we're coming through that GPS waypoint, and then here we are finally in Bishop. I would say for somebody who's never been in that area before, going through that 3D flight, you don't need it, but it's definitely good to kind of get an idea what it's going to look like out the windows. And I'll tell you, there's some big mountains over there. Even though we're flying an airplane and we're climbing really high, we're really not that high above that terrain. Of course, the valleys below are much lower, and most of the airports that we're going to be using are going to be down in the valleys. So it's a great feature. It is a premium feature. It does cost extra to have that, but for me to look through that and kind of get an idea of what I'm going to be looking out the window gives me a boost of confidence. So that brings us to the pilot. I actually met with a CFI who has experience in this area. They've been into the Bishop Airport, and it was a great time to kind of talk about some of the variables that need to be considered when going into that particular region and how unforgiving those mountains are. And this is something that I feel like you can't really quantify. I don't feel inadequate as a pilot, but that doesn't mean that I'm above asking other people for help in determining whether they feel like my airplane is capable of what I'm asking, and then reviewing my plan and saying, what do you think? How do you feel about this stuff? It was a great conversation, and some great points came out of that about that particular area that I've never been into. And so I'm glad I took that time. It does cost a little bit of money, but you know, when you're in that area and you feel confident, I think you can't really put a price on that. That brings us to the last thing that we really need to consider, and this thing is a very living thing, so there's not really an answer to it. Most of the stuff that we've talked about so far can be quantified and we can say yes or no, but this is something that's going to have to be kind of watched over the next few days, and that is weather. So that trip we're planning is probably somewhere around 3 to 4 days out. And just like any weather forecast, the forecasts are fairly generic this far out because, well, they're just not very accurate. And that's why we have to pay close attention to the weather as we get closer. The forecasts will become more accurate. So here, what we're looking at here is just what they call a prognostic chart, and it just gives us a big high-level overview of weather systems that are happening in different areas. And if we look at where we're going to be taking off up here in Idaho, it looks like there's a bit of a stationary front that's kind of there, but there's a big red L, and that means there's actually a low pressure system there. We do see these big blue lines with blue triangles. That's what's called a cold front, and that's going to create some weather. It is. We need to be conscientious of that. But down here in Nevada, we actually see there's a big blue H, but it's all surrounded by these red L's and some orange dashed lines. So there's definitely going to be some consideration for weather in this area. The high pressure, that blue H, is going to be probably good weather. And it looks like it's fairly centered along our route, so that's good. And these maroon lines that kind of look squiggly and drunk, those actually represent what's called a pressure gradient. And these maroon lines are actually quite far apart, is a good thing. If we find an area like this hurricane, this tropical storm down here, where the lines are really close together, that's going to be very aggressive weather. Where out here, where we've got this large gap, it's almost as big as Arizona between the lines. That means that things are somewhat stable relatively. Anyway, so we're looking at this weather, and what we're trying to figure out is whether or not it's a good idea to go. As we get closer, we're going to start to see things like this showing on the forecast. This kind of hatched area is areas that are at risk for thunderstorms, and anywhere that there's actually red, there's a extreme chance of thunderstorms. We don't have those yet for the time that we're going to be departing, so we'll have to just wait patiently to keep an eye on that and figure out whether it's a good idea to go or not. There's one very subtle thing that I think it might be really cool to share with you guys, and it's called density altitude. It's kind of a weird concept, but it's the idea that air is not one particular density all the time. We have high pressure areas and we have temperature, and those pressures and the temperatures will change the density of the air. And the simplest way to think of this is in what we call density altitude. So looking at our destination of Bishop, California, we know that the altitude of the runway is around 4,000 feet. If we look at the airport information, we see that it's about 4,124 feet. That's its physical altitude. But if we look at the weather for that area, it looks like the density altitude is actually 7,730 feet. To kind of exaggerate that a little bit more, let's go over here to Mammoth. So Mammoth Airport is at 7,135 feet. That's high. That's pretty high, right? But if we look at the weather, the density altitude is almost 10,000 feet. That's really important because your airplane is going to perform based on the density altitude, not the physical altitude. So flying into this area, even though the airport is about 4,000 feet, which isn't crazy high, your airplane is going to fly and perform as though it's 7,000 feet, which is a very different thing. And I think those are important details to understand about flying, whether you're flying at night or during the day or in a high pressure system or low pressure system, or whether it's humid outside. All of those things are a factor in how an airplane is going to perform. One thing that every flight plan should have is an alternate. When we talk about driving a car, we might say, well, we plan on going this way, but if we get there and maybe the roads are closed or the weather changes, we might go this way. Well, it's no different with aviation. What we want to do is make sure that we're not going into an area where we're going to have problems. Airports do close and runways are closed. Maybe somebody crashes an airplane right before we get there, and they have to close the runways because it's too hazardous to land. Well, guess what? We don't get to land there, so we've got to do something else. And because this area is so unforgiving, we want to make sure that we've got a plan. We're not just flying in there, and if it doesn't work out, we'll just sort it out in the air. You don't want to be trying to figure that stuff out and flying an airplane. It's much easier to do right here, sitting at the chair. So let's take a quick look at the plan, and we'll just kind of figure out what our alternate will be, and that way we know going in. All right, so we're here at Bishop, and let's pretend we get all the way down here and the runway's closed. Or worse yet, one of these red things, this temporary flight restrictions pops up, and for some reason we can't land. I think we need to be making that decision before we go in between these mountains. So there's mountains on both sides, and they're extremely high. So we need to be making that decision probably somewhere back here. Let's call it Mina. So let's say we get to Mina, we check the weather at Bishop, and we get some sort of notification that the runways are closed or the winds are too severe or something else is causing us to not be able to land. Mina would be a place to land, right? It's got a runway, it's got an airport, but it looks like the runway is actually dirt. So I'm not really feeling landing on a dirt runway, although it's certainly within the capability of the airplane, maybe not the best way. But if we look over here, oh, and there's one other factor. There's no weather available at Mina, so we'd have to kind of figure it out from the air. But over here, there's a little town called Hawthorne, and it looks like they have weather available, so the airport can tell us what the winds are doing, and we can kind of make a decision about whether it's a good idea to land there or not. And it looks like they've got a couple of different runways, so that's nice. One's dirt, one's asphalt. And it looks like the asphalt one's particularly long, 6,000 feet. So plenty of runway to get landed. It looks like it's near a major highway, so if we needed to drive somewhere, we could probably get a ride and get out of there. But, looking more big picture, let's say that the winds are too much at Hawthorne. I don't know why, but let's pretend it's doing the same thing that Winnemucca is. Although right now it looks like it's actually doing okay. We got about 6 knots of crosswind, which is, we can manage that. So then we want to look north, and what we might end up doing is having to fly up to Fallon, Nevada, or maybe even over to Reno. Reno's obviously a very busy area with commercial traffic, so we probably don't want to go in there if we don't have to, but this gives us some idea, kind of making a plan. So I think what we can plan is, if we have to divert, we could probably check with Hawthorne. If Hawthorne's not great, we could go north, or if we had to, we could land at Mina. So one thing that we need to talk about, going back to the airplane, is how to load the airplane. And with cars, like I said before, we just pack it to the ceiling and you can't see out the back doors, right? And then we drive way too fast. But with an airplane, we are limited. Let's talk just a little bit about planning our luggage. There is a limitation to the airplane and how much it can carry safely, and the design limits. And those design limits aren't like it won't get off the ground. It actually has more to do with the structural limitations of the wings, and we want to make sure that we're not overloading those wings, say if we were to get into really turbulent air. And we have a really cool tool that will help us to figure that out really quickly. So this tool is what's called weight and balance, and it's how airplanes work. And even when you fly on a commercial jet, they actually do this same calculation. They just don't tell you that they do it, but it's how they make sure that the airplane will fly and that it will fly safely. So this little box in the middle of the screen called weight, and then we have CG, and the CG stands for the center of gravity, and it has what's called an envelope. That black line that kind of looks like a building is actually the envelope that is safe to load the airplane. On the left side, we can tell the computer how much our pilot weighs. Let's say it's 220. That works. And then how much our co-pilot weighs. In this case, we won't have a co-pilot because they're going to be sitting in the back seat. And so let's put our passenger in there. Let's put 140 for the passenger. And then we can uncheck the co-pilot because we don't have anybody there. And then we're going to have quite a bit of luggage, but we're probably not going to put all of that luggage in the baggage area because there's actually a limit to the amount of weight we can put back there. So we're going to put some of that in the front seat. So let's say that we put 75 pounds of our luggage in the front seat, and then let's say we end up putting another 75 pounds of it in the back passenger seat. We do have some things that we carry in the airplane all the time, like spare oil, a survival kit, flares, a tow bar, a step stool, stuff like that. And we know the weight of that stuff is 80 pounds. But let's say that we're going to add another 20 pounds of luggage, call it sleeping bags or pillows or whatever we're going to put in the back. So we know that those are the weights of the things that we're going to put in the airplane. And then we can tell it how much fuel. And again, this is where weight comes to play. So we know what full fuel is, and that's 79 gallons. So we'll leave that at 79 gallons. Now, looking at the far right side, if you look at the top, it says our takeoff weight is 2,900 pounds, or just about. But at the very tip top, it says our maximum weight is 2,950 pounds. So we're within 60 pounds of the maximum weight, takeoff weight for this aircraft. And of course, we're going to burn fuel. So if we look down here to the right, we have a landing weight. So as we burn off gas, we're going to get lighter, right? At around 2,800 pounds. So we're a little bit lower. And it also tells us how much fuel that we'll have remaining. So what we can do if we look in the middle here, that circle is our takeoff weight and envelope, and the square is our landing weight. What we want to do is try to keep the aircraft balanced. It'll fly better, it'll fly faster, it'll handle better, all those things if the airplane's balanced. And we're actually kind of leaning the right direction. Let's see what happens if we move some of this weight back. So by putting the weight in the front, we're actually adding to the 4CG, or the forward center of gravity. So if we put all this weight in the back, I wonder what will happen if we put all 150 pounds in the back seat and we take the pilot out of it. So it looks like it moved our center of gravity aft quite a bit. You can see it's a pretty big jump to the rear. So we want to think carefully about how we load the airplane and keep the center of gravity such that we're not burning extra fuel and we're not jeopardizing the aircraft. If we put too much weight in here, let's pretend like we put a 220-pound co-pilot in here. See, now we're overweight, and that's because we're out of the envelope here. We've gone over the weight in the CG. If we put a bunch of weight in the front and we don't have anybody in the back, let's say we put somebody big up here. Let's put a 300-pounder just because we can. We're right on the edge of that envelope, and we want to be careful because it's going to make the airplane handle very poorly. So let's just not do that. Considering that we're going to be flying at a particularly high altitude, think about it. How much time do you spend at 10,500 feet? Not very much, and neither do we. Although we're pretty fit people, it's probably not going to be a problem, but we want to be conscientious about altitude because it sneaks up on you. So we are going to be flying a fairly high altitude, 10,500, in a non-pressurized airplane. So the things you fly commercially, they're all pressurized, and they seem to simulate, I think, around 5,000 feet cabin altitude. So we're going to be twice that. So we're going to be taking oxygen with us, and that'll give us something to help us make sure that we're not being oxygen deprived or hypoxia. We're actually going to use what's called a pulse oximeter on our finger, and that'll help just monitor this blood saturation, oxygen saturation of our blood, so that we don't end up in a hypoxia situation, which would be not good for everybody, especially the pilot. Well, that about does it for planning this flight. Of course, there's a lot of things that I couldn't share in this video. I tried to keep it interesting and basic. If you have an interest in more detailed flight planning, use Google. There's lots of YouTube videos out there. And of course, you could always go to ground school and kind of learn about the fundamentals of aviation, the book knowledge, and that'll help you to understand how the charts work and how weather systems work and how the weather information works. And it's a very interesting process. I'm going to be keeping a close eye on the weather as our departure dates, I'll call it dates because we're never set in stone, get closer, and we'll have to make a decision about when it would be a good idea to go. Of course, all of this stuff has to be done in reverse, going the other way, right? Because if we're there for any amount of time, all of this stuff can change. The weather, the flight restrictions, and of course, the number one temptation when you go on vacation is to pack a bunch of extra stuff and bring it home. So we're gonna have to be very careful when we come home that we don't add a bunch of useless weight to the airplane. If you're curious what's involved in getting the airplane ready to go for a trip like this, give the video that we just shot a watch. It's really interesting what's involved in making sure that you have all the right stuff in an airplane because, let's be honest, you're not just going to pull over at a Walmart and grab a couple of things that you forgot at home. I suppose it's worth mentioning that there's a likelihood that we won't even make this flight at all, and that's a reality of general aviation. We've done the work to prepare the plane, we've done the planning to make sure that the mission is doable, and as our departure dates get closer, we'll make a decision about whether to go or not. If we go, we'll try to link to the video so that you can enjoy that flight and see how this all came together into a successful mission. All right, ready to go on this crazy trip?
Oh, I'm ready.
Oh man, ready or
excited.
not? Ready or not, here we go. And we're up and away.
Bishop traffic, Skylane 52337, we are 13 miles north of the airport, descending through 8,000, direct to Bishop.
There's the airport.
There it is.